Hi, everybody. Andrew Cuneo here, and I'm back with Matt Sperling. Today,
Hey
we're going to
everyone.
be going over our experiences at the Streets of New Capenna Set Championship that just happened. So, welcome back, Matt.
Thanks for having me back. We talked about the new format before, this whole tournament where some of the dust would settle, and now I'm glad to come back on and talk about what we think now.
Yeah, so the Set Championship, I noticed that you played Esper in Standard and Azorius Auras. Can you talk about kind of how you decided on those decks and whether you were happy with your choices after the fact?
Yeah, our team's preparation, we had a pretty big team, so it was interesting. I mean, sometimes you have a smaller team and you sort of concede that you're not going to have full coverage of trying out every deck, but you sort of, so you sort of narrow your focus out of necessity. We didn't have that necessity, but we still sort of narrowed our focus probably a little too much. So we really struggled to find strategies that consistently beat Esper. And so at a certain point, we just went like, look, I mean, we've tried so many times. We feel like you have to really bend your deck, and we're just going to play Esper. And almost all of us did. There was like 20 of us that played Esper. It ended up not being, it wasn't a good result for us. I mean, our team win rate was really not good. The Esper win rate wasn't good, all that stuff. So there was a mix of like our deck being, also we played like main deck Rave and Feebleman, and sort of got a real tunnel vision on Esper. I don't think it was a good choice. I think now there's two of these professional level tournaments in a row where I've decided not to play a Fable of the Mirror Breaker deck, and it's probably a mistake in at least one of those tournaments, probably both. But we just, we tried Jund, and we tried Control, and we tried Dragon Combo, and we just, in every instance, we just would play 10-game sets, and Esper win 6. Then we played a 5-game set, and Esper win 3. And it just, we weren't able to get the right list. Now, I think other teams spent a little bit more effort, found those decks, and did better. So that was how Standard went. In Historic, I wanted to play Azorius Auras again. I had a list where with the Hearse instead of the Rest in Peace that I liked. I wish I would have worked harder at making the deck really good against 2-drop creatures. I mean, that was really what you had to do in that tournament, no matter what you played, I think. I mean, there were the food decks have 1 and 2 mana creatures, the Aura decks, the Phoenix decks found ways to play new and different small creatures. And blue-white control just wasn't good enough against all those. The lists I had, but I wish I had tried harder. Anyways, and so I sort of played Auras out of process of elimination / trusting my teammates. The Auras deck didn't perform very well for me or for I made day 2 of the tournament, but then went like 2 and 6 on day 2. So neither deck performed well. And in the aggregate, we had many people playing the decks I played, and the aggregate numbers weren't good either. So definitely was regretting my deck choices. And the process that led me there was just sort of not finding anything better, which is sometimes where you end up.
Yeah, I played Grixis Vampires, which was sort of our team's deck, and we did well with that deck. I was pretty happy with that. I played Tainted Pact in Historic, which was just kind of a concession to not liking any of the main decks in Historic. And I only went 3 and 5 with that. That deck definitely let me down some, which a big part of the problem was that I just don't think I got very good matchups with that deck. Like, I want to play against food every round, and I didn't get to play against food at all. And I really want to dodge the decks that are kind of like cheap threats plus soft counters, which the worst possible configuration is playing against somebody who's playing Esper Sentinel with Metallic Rebuke, Spell Pierce, stuff like that. And I had to play against that a lot, which that was a little bit of bad luck, but also I think my deck just didn't line up particularly well for the field.
Yeah, I was also, I did play against some food, some blue-white affinity. And yeah, the Auras deck, unfortunately, the way we had configured it, not enough interaction. And so you sort of had to win the die roll and maybe outdraw your opponent a little bit. And then I played a couple matchups like against a Grixis Death Shadow deck that was just all removal, where I just had no chance to win. And I was really kicking myself for not having played blue-white at that point. because I think I played food 3 times. I played that Grixis deck, and I think I would have chewed those decks up with blue white. But then the problem was my team had a lot of people that thought Auras was really well positioned, and the blue white Auras matchup's not that great. So anyways, it was sort of a case study in, even if you have 20 people, if some group think starts happening, and all of a sudden you don't have 20 people trying 20 different things, or even 20 people trying 5 different things, but you have 20 people trying 2 different things, some really negative things can happen. I mean, you start to you might even pick the deck that's better in the matchup among those 2 decks because your team's so big. I mean, a lot of bad things happen. So I didn't have a great experience this time. I thought the Grixis deck was pretty. We actually tried a deck with that Grixis deck with that new 3-drop that like impulses. Canister was like, we should try this card, and we tried it. We didn't find the vampires theme, but we sort of had that going, and it was interesting. So I thought that was a cool deck. When I saw that you were playing Tainted Pact, yeah, I was a little worried. I mean, it seems like that's been your pet deck for a while, and so it probably meant, for at least for me, it's hard for that deck to gain a lot because it only gains 1 slot at a time. It probably to me represented that, Andrew probably didn't feel confident in another deck, so he sort of went back to his blue-black control, Tainted Pact type of roots that you've played a number of times. So I sort of read the tea leaves on that one. But the Great Vampires deck was super cool.
You didn't give my Tainted Pact deck credit for having the highest win rate at the previous set championships?
No, I mean, look, I'm not saying it's a bad deck, but it's.
I literally had the highest win rate of any archetype in the previous set championships. I went 3-1, didn't make day 2, but I had a 75%. Nobody beat that.
There you go. That's a huge sample size, and no wonder you ran it back. Yeah, that makes sense.
So I wanted to ask you about, I guess, some of your impressions about how to build Esper, because I looked at your specific list and I noticed a couple things about it. One was the main deck Ray of Enfeeblements, which if people on our team had played Esper, and I think maybe Ely did actually, our lists all had like one main deck Ray of Enfeeblement. We liked that. But you seemed like you were kind of down on that after having done it.
Yeah, I mean, I posted a poll at one point internally in our Discord that was like, is this a 1 deck format? Like, do we really think, you're going to play against Esper half the time, and you're going to sort of and Esper was the most played deck, so it was weird. It was like some of that played out the way we thought it would. Most, Esper was the number 1 deck. 77 people played it, or whatever the figure was. And it was like, okay, well, if that's the case, I mean, you want to have, it's about like efficiency and tempo, and doing 2 things in a turn in a tempo matchup is really good. And this removal spell costs 1, so it's going to let you do that. We played Duress main deck as well. Duress is another card, lets you do 2 things in a turn and sort of try to turn a corner in a way where if your opponent's only doing 1 thing a turn, just preparing for that kind of like tempo mid-range mirror. We tried it. But then I just, you play the tournament, and it's like I play against Izzet multiple rounds. You play against a Grixis 1 round. You play against, an Esper mirror here, Esper mirror there. But so maybe it was the way the pairing shook out. But then again, I'm looking at my team's data in aggregate. It didn't seem like we were actually favored in the mirror at the end of the day, is what it looked like. So I don't know. We must have missed something. As I sit here, I don't know exactly what it was, but I certainly wasn't feeling like those Rays were good most of the time, because I wasn't playing as Esper most of the time. Just in the random, whatever it was, 7 or 8 historic matches I played in the tournament, it certainly wasn't 5 Esper. So, and the White Weenie matchup was I don't know. White Weenie ended up not being it was sort of like a weaker Esper. It wasn't a very strong deck. The stronger decks that emerged, the winner of the tournament, Jessica Hinata, well, you can use Ray there, but I didn't play against that. Anyways, when you play against dragons and you draw that card, you're just like, well, that's a bummer. There's a card I have to hope to loot away. Part of the theory with playing random cards in the Esper deck is you do have some looting to potentially discard those cards. Sure, that helps, but you'd still rather have put what some of the other teams found, something like an annul or whatever it was other teams found that could actually give you an edge against Fable the Mirror Break, which again a card that I think I failed to recognize how strong it was for a couple tournaments in a row now. And it's sort of like fool me once, shame on you. At this point, I should have realized like that card is I should be looking for a reason to play that card, not not avoiding it. So anyways, that's some of my sentiments about how it went.
Yeah, we even had one Ray of Enfeeblement in the main deck of our Grixis deck, which, like, we already had plenty of good removal, but we just thought Ray of Enfeeblement was well positioned.
Yeah.
Like, our expected metagame was Esper being the main deck, and then Runes being second, which is what actually happened. And we also spent a while testing against, like, Magda, Jaspera Sentinel decks, and Ray of Enfeeblement's fine there, too.
Yeah,
so
that's fair.
We felt like Ray of Enfeeblement was going to be a pretty good card against a pretty sizable chunk of the field, and that is kind of how it shook out. Like,
yeah,
I wasn't unhappy to have one in my main deck.
Yeah, I agree. That was our prediction. That's how it played out. Maybe it was just that I don't know. Maybe it was that the delta between Ray of Enfeeblement and Doomblade lose 2 life when you play against runes. That delta of that, okay, I have the Ray instead of the Doomblade, versus the delta when you play against Blue-Red Dragon combo and you have the Ray of Enfeeblement versus the Doomblade, that delta, I think maybe it was a failure to recognize how significant that difference was. I think the Esper decks, that if you look at the 2 that made top 8 that had a very similar list, if not the same, and they had like 4 Vanishing Burst, 3 of the Inferno Grasp, that Doomblade effect. And I suspect that's what's going on. That, Ray of Enfeeblement's great against runes, but the Doomblade's probably good enough if you have that much removal. And against dragons, you're going to be like really thankful to have 7 ways to kill a Goldspan dragon instead of 4 or 5. I suspect like that was probably the dynamic. That's probably like a more concrete way to express my regret about Ray of Enfeeblement. Not that the Ray was bad, like writ large, but that it just had some problems against some of the popular decks that weren't number 1 or number 2.
Yeah, that's fair. The other card I wanted to ask you about was Kaito Shizuki. You guys had 4 in your deck. The Esper list that made the top 8 were only playing 1. And on our Grixis deck, I think most people on our team played 2. A few people maybe played 3. So was that a card that you guys felt strongly you should have 4 of?
No, not strongly. I mean, as a team, even the folks who submitted the same list with 2, even that some people played 3, some people played 4. So we didn't think 4 was in any way sacred. Paul and I played 4, and again, we just thought it was like you're going to play a lot of mirror and try to get ahead, stay ahead. And if we can play the cheaper spells, like we played 2 Duress and 2 Ray main, then it was more sort of like that complements that strategy as opposed to like 4 Kaito being, again, some kind of sacred cow. And the theory is you're expending your cards quicker, you're more likely to be ahead in terms of the game state. And then Kaito is, of course, like one of the best cards in the format if on the condition that you're ahead. And it struggles when you're not ahead. Anyways, so that was the theory, that we'd play more cheap spells. We'd plan on playing 2 things in a tournament. One of them's Kaito, great, we're refilling our hand, that sort of thing. And in testing, it worked out well enough. In the tournament, not so well.
Yeah, that's fair. I've never been a big fan of Kaito, like because it really only functions the way you said, where it's good if you're ahead. But I just felt like so much of this standard, everybody's deck, they're trying to play from ahead. Like the way the standard works, once you fall behind, it's so hard to catch up that you couldn't expect that good people were going to show up with decks where they're like, yeah, I'm going to fall behind and then something's going to happen. I guess the Dragons deck, that happens a little bit, or the Hinata deck maybe, but I think for most of the field, they're just looking to be ahead.
Oh, I totally agree. And I don't think the results indicate that our thinking about this whole Kaito strategy was the approach. I mean, the decks that had fewer did better. So I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if there's an exact inverse correlation, but I mean, certainly like the way we did versus the folks who really excelled at the top of the Esper rankings, where they went to like one Kaito with more removal. That seemed like a better approach. And removal is better when you're behind. Removal, you can trade, you can get a more expensive card of your opponent, whereas Kaito in some game states you pay 3 mana and you cycle it or loot, or it doesn't trade up in mana. You could be getting no mana advantage. So that seemed to be the way it played out. So yeah, even though we came in with that logic, not something I'm advocating now.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't want to drag you to the pain of your actual list any longer, but I thought it would be nice to kind of go over some of the cards that the last time we were talking, we went over cards from kind of the spoiler that we thought would be important or interesting cards in standard, and just go over some of the bigger misses we had, I guess.
Sure.
And number one on that list has got to be Obnixilis. Like when we talked, I think we both thought it was going to be a good card. I was maybe a little bit more lukewarm on it than you, but I thought it was going to show up, and I don't think anyone played any copies in the top 8 at all. Like it just was not a part of the standard format, really.
And we realized in testing that that's not a card that I want to show up with in standard. And yeah, I mean, I think some of the skepticism that you expressed, you said you weren't as high as others, but you still, like you said, you still thought it would show up. You thought it'd be a powerful card. I was high on it. I thought like this card is really powerful, but it has a really, really specific problem that ends up being a big problem in standard. That it's at its best when the opponent isn't playing to the board in a way that can attack. And it's just like not enough strategies in standard are about that. I mean, just way too many strategies in standard are actually to deploy to the board. Whether it's, Luminarch Aspirant is really popular, and Goldspan Dragon and other cards, but there's just a lot of playing to the board and not a lot of sitting back and hoping to control your opponent with a Wrath of God and then a Divination and another Wrath of God and then a target removal. So Obnixilis, if it's like some kind of predator, if it's a wolf that can only eat deer, and there's just no deer in that ecosystem, there's no pure control. Even the control decks that did show up have these 4/4 creatures that are flying that can attack, so that your little devil can't block. It's just not the right ecosystem for that card. I could totally imagine a different format where it would be really good. Now, the fact that it did so much worse than we predicted means there's more than just that going on. It also must be a weaker card than what I had anticipated. And I think part of that is just that it's not as trivial to sacrifice a creature as it looks on paper. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of cards that help you get there, but now you've got to put those cards in your deck. And if the format isn't developing in a way where you want to have a 1/1 Festering Goblin in play, then it's actually a really meaningful cost to depend on having that creature out, right? So there's a couple of layers in there. Hopefully folks can follow that, right? It's like, I've got to put these creatures in my deck that I intend to sacrifice. Those cards have to be functional when I don't have Obnixilis, functional when I'm behind, okay at whatever they're blocking, whatever else they're intended to do. And the format didn't play out that way. So I think for all those reasons, we determined in testing, like Obnixilis, I wasn't going to touch that card.
Yeah, we stuck with Obnixilis for a little bit longer there, just to keep trying it because we thought that people would want to play with it, but there was no matchups where it was good. Basically, it was only ever good if you were on the play and you had the good draw with it. And even then, it wasn't better than other things you could be doing. So I think that card is not gonna really have a time to shine at any point. I don't think that once we hit rotation, it's going to pick up. I think it's just too narrow of a card, really. Like maybe there'll be times when you want to have it in your sideboard, but even then, I think you could maybe do better.
What do you think, like in a different format where there's a different composition of control decks versus aggro and mid range, it could shine? Like, would it surprise you if somebody's legacy deck had 3 copies and did well?
Yes, that would surprise me. Like, I
Yeah,
played against it a fair amount in Historic as well, and even just playing, like, straight up Control, it just isn't powerful enough. Like, the Control decks will just kind of go over the top of it a lot of the time.
yeah.
Um, Also, the other thing about that card is it's pretty easy to just get enough life gain in your deck that you can kind of ignore the triggers for a while.
Yeah, I think you can have. That's definitely something I noticed playing with and against it too. You can have an incidental creature, a Shark Typhoon token or whatever, or incidental life gain, and like both of those things frustrate. Or you know what? Or like my creature just didn't live, and so it's so poor if you can't kick it, or not kick
Yeah.
it, whatever that ability is called. And so yeah, there's definitely a lot of things going on. I mean, you're probably right. I mean, again, just looking at how it's played out so far, how could you be optimistic about the card? I haven't thought about it in other formats, but like there have been formats over time where your opponent is actually relatively unlikely to be able to attack your planeswalker in a meaningful way. In which case, I can imagine it being good if your opponent you put two of them in play and the opponent's looking at the prospect of facing those two for the whole game. It could be good, but yeah, like you said, I mean, it sort of played out in a different way where the Punisher mechanic always looks better on paper than how it plays out. And this is just no different. I'm at 18, I'll take 2. I'm at 4, I discard a card. And the cumulative effect of giving your opponent the choice really weakens the card.
All right, different card, Elspeth Resplendent, which is one that I was maybe a little bit high on. I don't think you were that high on going into the release of the set. And for the first week or two, it seemed like Elspeth Resplendent was like a surprisingly strong card. But when we got to the set championships, it saw very little play, I would say.
I almost put it in my deck. I was very close to submitting it. The thing I liked about it the most was actually that I was playing powerful 3-mana permanent sideboard cards, particularly the Archon, and the Archon being really strong as runes. Like I thought that was actually like having your expensive spell sort of tutor for a card that's gonna like end the game in certain matchups. I thought that was really powerful. At the end of the day, 5 mana is just a lot of mana, and there was enough sort of obscure interceptor and disdainful stroke going around duress that at the end of the day I ended up not submitting it. That card I think will have its time to shine. I think whether it's after the rotation or otherwise, I like that card. I think it'll find a home. Also, like white, one thing that hurts it is that white weenie, aggressive white strategy in general. As soon as you like are really moving into that space, you want to be a Thalia deck. It's really hard to have a spell curve topper at 5 mana in a Thalia deck. So there's sort of that problem is gonna be around for a little bit. If there was a different dynamic in the white decks, you might have seen it already a little bit more as a curve topper. Anyways, I think that card will have its time to shine. But yeah, this set championship wasn't it. Were you guys trying it, playing with it, and like what was your experience in testing with it?
We didn't really have it in the runes deck very much, I don't think, or in the Esper deck. We had it in the sideboard of runes for a little while, and it was like fine in that deck. I don't know that it really added a new dimension to the deck or anything. It was just if you wanted to sideboard into a more grindy deck, you could do it with that Elspeth, which you could have done it with other cards too. I don't think it's a bad card. I don't know that there's any spot where it's really a standout. So I think maybe after rotation, when there's just fewer cards in standard, people will turn to it. I don't expect to see it. In this iteration of standard, I don't think there's going to be any way where people iterate on decks and they wind up adding it to their deck in meaningful numbers.
Yeah, there's the things that you're worried about in this format are overall, I think they're just a little too powerful to put 5 mana into that. I think in a future format though, it's going to be at its best when your 3 mana permanents are giving you more than 3 mana. if you think wedding announcement in whatever metagame emerges later, like having more wedding announcements out than your opponent is really important. Then Elspeth becomes an interesting card. If you have wedding announcement and another 3-drop, and if you have 2 other 3-drops, and having both of them in play gives you something more than the sum of its parts, Elspeth will be an interesting card. So that was my experience. Was just like we found some of us in our team main deck in Archon of Meria, right? Just identifying that as a card, like, man, if I can get access to that. So I think, keep an eye on that. If you're curious about when that card gets stronger, we'll see how it plays out. But it does that again. It does get you through a chunkier deck relatively quickly, looking for those types of things, 3-mana permanents, and can protect them with a shield counter.
Yeah. So what about Gala Greeters? That showed up in 2 people's deck in the top 8, and my experience with that card was I played maybe 1 game with it in a deck, and I was just like, this card is so bad, I just want to take it out of my deck immediately. Did you try that card at all? Do you have an opinion on it?
Yeah, I also tried it and found it. I thought it was a really poor top deck and wasn't strong enough even when you did have it on time. And it had some other problems too. I mean, like just being a 1/1 that doesn't give you something right away meant that like any removal spell you can imagine, would sort of even someone's Ray that was dangling, and again our team was certainly playing those main deck or whatever. Any removal spell you can imagine gets rid of it, and you haven't gotten anything to show for it. Plus, like other 2-drops we thought were actually performing a little bit nicer and a little bit better. Whether it was like the Black Market Tycoon or anyways. So yeah, my experience was like yours, that I was like, yeah, this isn't where I want to be. And in fact, I ended up in playtesting more frequently playing with the halfling
Prosperous Innkeeper
than I was playing with Gala Greeters. So, I think Gala Greeters, you'd have to be so all in. And yeah, it was in Shota's deck. I was surprised to see it. So it's not like it's an unplayable card, but in my experience, it wasn't a card I was looking to play. Sounds like you had a similar experience.
Yeah, I was amazed that it showed up to the extent that it did in people's decks. Shota has a long history of showing up and doing really well with decks that don't have a lot of legs. Like I think he plays the decks exceptionally well, but on the construction front, sometimes he makes pretty strange choices.
Yeah, and look, I mean, you have to realize if you're viewing these tournaments and looking at the results, you have to realize that these tournaments are not a large enough sample to know whether two copies of a card you played helped you or hurt you. Because you might, again, like you said, you might have been playing well, you might have had good matchups, you might have drawn well, to where one of those choices could have been hurting you the whole time, and it's not necessarily going to show up in the results. So I'm with you. I'm skeptical that you want to build a Meathook Massacre Gala Greeters deck, even though I'm glancing over to this screen. I see it here on the screen. That's what was played. I'm skeptical that's what I'm going to want to do next week.
Yeah. Did you try Titan of Industry decks at all?
Yeah. Early on, we had a mono green deck that was humming along, and Titan of Industry was fine. As we got more mature in the process, it became clear that it wasn't really going to save you from people going really over the top. Plus, cards like Disdainful Stroke were going to be popular because of these dragon combo strategies. So there were a few things sort of stacked up to make us move away from trying that card, but the card itself and the strategies around it, I wouldn't say they were like super underwhelming or anything. It just didn't feel like exactly where we wanted to be for this tournament. That I wouldn't be surprised if that card was good in some future format.
Yeah, I had pretty much the same experience. I thought it was especially disappointing that against runes, like Titan of Industry, the rune stack would just go over the top of it so easily.
Yeah, they play Absolutely. They pay 4 mana and they play, the White Red Saga. I'm so bad with card names.
Showdown of Skulls.
Probably the worst, the worst podcast guest you could imagine from a card name perspective. So you play your Red White Saga for 4 mana as a Runes player, and your opponent, you exile whatever 4 cards you exile. You can almost let the opponent pick them, and then they go and they pay 7 mana and they get like a 7/7 and a 4/4. It's just not even close. Who's gonna have the bigger board, bigger creature? The resulting turn, if you untap and you play the 7. Yeah, I totally agree. So runes makes it kind of a joke, and then again, like even Rafine can run away with a game in a way that none of the modes get you back, because now they've got the perfect hand, and it's either got 2 removal, disable stroke. There's a 7/9 creature on the 7/10 creature on the board. Like I agree. Like there was the things people were doing were really powerful. We talked about it in our little preview about how this is like a big standard. People are going to find synergistic strategies that do things that are pretty explosive. And so just doing a sort of basic nuts and bolts, ramp, 7/7 may not be enough. I think that's how it played out.
I was kind of high on Ziatora when we did the last show. And I tested it a lot. Now, I think it is actually a really strong card. Some people showed up at the set championship with really Ziatora professional face breaker decks. I don't think they did particularly great, but I do think I was impressed by the card Ziatora. Did you try that one at all?
Yeah. And we the Gen deck that I thought was one of the better non-Esper decks took advantage of that card. And it had a very important hidden property, protection from Vanishing Verse. I don't know whether we talked about that in our preview, but it ends up being a big part of what's going on with that card, I think. My criticism, if I recall, of the card was like, if I put 6 mana into a creature and it better either win me the game or give me something immediate. And there was I think we went back and forth a little bit on whether the end step was immediate enough to qualify. But the fact that some of the rule of the format doesn't hit it is another thing. Again, it has that invisible protection from, that spell. So yeah, I liked it in testing. I didn't like there's the other Ziatora card, the 5/4, the Ziatora's whatever. Envoy. And that card was interesting. Some members of our team liked that more than others. What do you think of that card?
I tried it briefly and then just thought it wasn't good enough, basically.
Yeah.
It wasn't awful, but it just didn't really... It didn't do anything special, for sure. It was just like a 5/4 body you were hoping to get a little bit of card advantage out of, which for 4 mana isn't exciting.
That was my experience. And I also think it's at a really weird mana cost for the red decks, because you have Fable, the Mirror Breaker. It's going to ramp you to 5, but what it does for 5 requires you to do that pre-combat. And if you're at 4, I thought it was okay. I landed on the same place. There's it has this weird non-interaction with Fable where I'd rather just play Goldspan Dragon or something. Anyways, I also sort of didn't love it, although it had a certain appeal. The fact that you couldn't Vanishing Verse it was somewhat appealing, and it could win a game on its own. And you couldn't, if the opponent had 2 Vanishing Verse and a Ray of Enfeeblement, and you play that card, you were probably going to win that game. So that was appealing.
Well, you brought it up, this kind of tension between whether or not your threats can be hit by Vanishing Verse, and it's kind of a subject I wanted to dive into, just the general state of removal in Standard, which I came away from the Standard thinking that the gameplay in it was really not particularly good. And a lot of that is because I think that the removal, you just don't have very many options for removal, and it's just not powerful enough to catch you up against the really good 3-drops, especially Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which is just, I think that's the best card in Standard, and it's so hard to put cards in your deck that are good against it.
I agree. And I was envious of the people who found the annul. Your Grixis list had annul. I mean, Yeah, for that, just for that reason alone. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it's less about the removal being bad, because there's no arguing that Vanishing Verse and Infernal Grasp are like efficient removal spells, in my opinion. Like I don't think that's what I'm gonna argue. I mean, it's like Vanishing Verse, it shouldn't be 2 mana, exile almost anything, draw a card. I mean, it's about as efficient as it ought to be. It's just that there are pretty cheap threats that function like, like a Titan, and it's like cost 3 mana. It's not a Titan, but you know what I mean. It's like it's built-in card advantage. It's talking now about Fable, the Mirror Breaker in particular, but it's not the only offender on that list. I mean, even at 2 mana, you have the Tenacious Underdog that, yeah, Vanity Verse specifically can trade favorably, but like a lot of the removal can't. And yeah, overall, like, removal's in a bad spot when the threats that people play you don't get ahead by using 1-for-1 removal on them. Then it requires you to have 1-for-1 removal and something else is going to get you over the top. And the Esper folks that did well, they seem to find that balance. That they had a lot of 1-for-1 removal in their deck, and the rest of their deck was sort of enough of their own 2-for-1s that was the game they were playing. But I agree with you, like, removal overall showed up plenty, did fine. Stuff like I thought going into the tournament, one of the most important removal spells was going to be the shock that you could sacrifice an artifact to deal 4. I think that.
Yeah, that was kind of the basis of our Grixis deck. Like, we spent a lot of time. We tried almost every red-black combination you could imagine, where you were going to play Blood Tithe Harvester, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and Voltage Surge, which is the shock you sack an artifact to. So we tried like Grixis, we tried Mardu, we tried, Jund builds, pretty much anything you could do to actually just enable Voltage Surge, because we thought that was the best removal spell in the format.
Yeah.
When I say I think the removal's in a bad spot, a big part of it is I think that they printed a lot of 3-mana removal spells, and they're just all completely unusable. Like Void Rend, Endless Detour. I mean, even Hero's Downfall is a legal card, which, looking back, nobody should have been surprised that Void Rend wound up being awful when Hero's Downfall has been legal this whole time and nobody plays with it.
Well, yeah, targeted 3-mana removal has like a giant Rafine problem that like it's gonna loom pretty large if that's the number 1 deck by a margin, which it was. So there's that. But even like a Soul Shadow that doesn't have that problem, it still suffers from other things. The fact that, like, if they play Wandering Emperor and you have removal, they get a 2/2 or a combat trick. They 2-for-1 you, and you paid 3 mana and they paid 4. That's not great, and that's like one of the better. I mean, that's not even like necessarily one of the bad ways it could play out. That's just something that people are playing 4 Wandering Emperor. Like, that's going to happen. That someone's board could be Luminarch Aspirant, Rafine, and some other creature that's becoming giant, and you have a removal spell. You spend 3 mana, and maybe you get to pick which of those creatures you kill, maybe not. If it's Soul Shadow, you don't get to pick. And it's like, well, there's clearly a problem, right? Like it doesn't. And the sweepers have a problem that's different. Anyways, so yeah, I agree. Like, we felt like, we put 4 Kaito in our deck because we thought being proactive was really, really important. We thought you wanted to have like a timely piece of interaction, but most of the time you want to just be doing like the one demanding an answer, because the answers couldn't keep up. And so Kaito is sort of the epitome of that, because it only plays that way. So yeah, I certainly agree with you.
Did you play enough with Unleash the Inferno to have an opinion on that one?
Is that the deal 7 you get disenchant on the back end?
Yes.
Yeah, we played. We did play. We were playing matches the whole time. We had sideboards. We had a bunch of sideboards, and yeah, I came away thinking, like, even though some of the time this plays out the way you want it to, it wasn't often enough for a 4-mana spell. I'm a firm believer in like really scrutinizing what point am I at on the curve? How powerful does it need to be? How consistently does it need to be that powerful? So we talk about 6-mana dragons. it's got to be like very consistently almost game ending. And 4 mana removal, it's got to be like a very clean 2-for-1. It's got to be like backbreaking. I don't know. I don't think that card is that often enough to be a card that I'm super interested in.
Yeah, I basically agree with that. There was kind of a tension in our team. Some people thought that card was really good, and I think the card's just kind of bad. Like people would cite it as a card you could play against Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which just doesn't even make any sense to me, because it's like if you play it immediately, you trade your 4 mana for their 3 mana. And like if you for some reason wait a turn and they've gotten the loot, like if you're trying to clean up the Fable of the Mirror Breaker 2 turns later, you're just really far behind on the interaction. It just.
I mean, there's some. Yeah, I hear you. I mean, there's some appeal. There's some appeal to it in the sense that you're always. I mean, the Fable of the Mirror Breaker is so good because they paid 3 mana for it. They're going to be ahead by a little bit. So maybe, there's a world in which that's the best you can do. I mean, what I mean to say, of course, in the abstract, I don't want to have conditional 4 mana removal for a 3 mana threat. Like that's not what I want in the abstract. But like I think more concretely, maybe it's the best you could do. And so there's a world in which that would be palatable to me. That wasn't my experience, but like I'm somewhat sympathetic to that argument. Now I think now saying, okay, set all that aside, what if we played a null? I mean, that's the kind of dialogue I'm interested in, right? We start with this thing where it's like, well, I'll bite the bullet, and but then you go, oh well, we could just play a null instead. And you go, oh yeah, let's do that. Let's answer it cleanly for 1 mana. Now it has to be on time, but like whatever. So that's how these discussions play out at a high level, I think. You have sort of the abstract level. You say, okay, let's talk about how it specifically shows up in this format. Like, what's the specific implementation in this format? And then you look for alternatives and say, look, if this is the best we can do, then it doesn't matter how abstractly weak it is. Or if you say, this isn't the best we can do, let's go do the other thing.
I was kind of always of the opinion that even if Unleash the Inferno is like the best you can do in Jund against Fable the Mirror Breaker, you were better off just putting proactive 4 mana cards in your deck and just hoping that, you got to be on the play or they stumbled a little bit or something. Because like trying to catch up from Jund with Unleash the Inferno, every once in a while would work in a spectacular fashion, but most of the time you just had a card that made you, lose a turn or 2 later than you otherwise would have. It really wasn't very good.
Certainly summarizes my sentiment on Void Rend versus Kaito in terms of like, there's good. I can imagine a million game states, specifically almost all the ones you're behind, in which Void Rend's better. But I'd rather just roll the dice and hope to be ahead and play the card. Yeah, so I mean, I'm with you on that. I agree with you, and I didn't favor that card. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you had a Jund deck that was just hoping to actually, for some reason, play from the back foot, and you go like, this Fable card keeps being like a real pain, it does have that upside. But it's good. I think that card's only going to be good if there's another broken type of enchantment or artifact where if their card is broken, it makes all the cards that get off the board a little better, and that card needs to get better to be playable.
Well, I think that's most of the stuff about Standard I was interested in talking about. Is there anything that stood out to you that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
About the Standard format specifically?
Or if you want to talk about Historic. I kind of skipped over Historic because I think it's pretty much been the same for the past 6 months.
I think a lot of people's takeaway from Historic is like, well, Pioneer can't get to Arena fast enough. Whatever the end state's going to be, let's get there because Historic is not great. But yeah, I mean, for Standard, I think we touched on most of my takeaways. I ended up like, it was sort of a format. It was a weird. It wasn't the worst format. I mean, there were teams could draw different conclusions, pick different strategies, and then really reap the rewards of the strategies they chose. I mean, it wasn't a one deck format. It was pretty dynamic. Even within archetypes, there were a ton of different choices. So of all the different ways that like a large standard can play out, it was okay. I didn't hate it. I didn't hate the standard. And I think like post rotation, my takeaways are just that like, yeah, some of the threats are really strong, and they're going to continue to sort of demand that control show up with something pretty unique in terms of way to get advanced, like a Teferi 5. If that shows up in a new set, maybe control can do something, because control needs to like have something where I tread water, trade 1 for a couple turns, and now I do something that's fundamentally so overpowered compared to what the non-controllers are doing that I can actually jump ahead. Haven't had that. Control's out of the picture until they get something like that, in my view. Those dynamics are going to stay around because the threats are so good, and those threats aren't rotating. So I don't know. I didn't hate the standard though. What was your overall sort of takeaway on the standard? Do you think it was like pretty good? Wasn't your favorite? I know you said that you thought the games didn't play out in that interesting a way. Was that sort of your overall ding on it?
Yeah, I tend to evaluate standard or just formats in general differently than most people. I think a lot of people place a really high premium on deck diversity, which this seemed to hit, pretty reasonably on deck diversity. That's not important to me at all. I want to like play interesting games, and I think that the standard was pretty lacking in that regard. Like so many of the games, it's just if one person goes 2-drop, 3-drop, and like the other person was on the draw and doesn't start till turn 3, a lot of the time they just can't keep up because their cards, like you're just behind one play, and there's not really a lot that's going to do anything about it. And it's very hard to flood out in this format. I mean, it's just very hard to flood out with the way the cards are designed now. So you like once you get on the back foot, the answers are never the answers never pull you ahead. You never feel like you're trading at an advantage with the answers. Even if you're saving on mana, you're generally down on value in some regard. Like it's very hard to spend 1 or 2 mana on something and feel like you really got an advantage. You just feel like you're breaking even at best usually. And like when you were talking about how people, with Unleash the Inferno, people might conclude that's the best you can do. I think that's actually what people have concluded with Infernal Grasp is like, you just have to have a card to play on turn 2. And Infernal Grasp really isn't a particularly good card, but it's just the best you can do. So like, it makes it so that you really, I think there's a lot of styles of playing Magic that are missing from the standard. Like certainly a more traditional control deck where you're really looking to like just interact with what your opponent's doing and set up for some sort of late game plan. That's missing because I think the removal, like the 1-for-1 removal is reasonable at 1 and 2 mana. It's like way too weak once you're spending 3 mana. And I think the sweepers generally are just way too weak as well. Like Meathook Massacre is great. That's not a traditional sweeper. Burn Down the House is probably the next best one. And even like the blue-red dragon combo deck, which is a little bit like a control deck, those didn't wind up playing. Maybe they had 1 copy in their 75. They barely played any. The same thing with like the Hinata decks. So there's very little control style decks. There aren't really ramp decks. And then in the more aggressive decks, it seems like you can't beat runes if you're trying to beat an aggressive deck. Not like you can't build a deck that beats runes. You just can't build a better aggressive deck than runes. And runes isn't like it isn't good enough to really beat the mid-range decks. So there just isn't a good aggro deck either.
The runes thing. There were many a list that I came up with, others came up with, where you said this ought to do pretty well against mid-range, and then that experiment would last as long as the period of time was before you or someone else thought about, well, what about the runes match? And you realize like, oh, this is just not going to beat runes. It's just about, there's certain polls that can exist. And runes is a really strong sort of this aggro combo pull where in order to get strong against you want to play that like that 1-for-1 game, like the Infernal Grasp game, like you want to play that, but then what happens when you get paired against, Fable the Mirror Breaker, now your card's bad. So yeah, no, I agree. And control is sort of endlessly stuck right in the wrong spots in that dynamic where it can't be flexible enough to move into the answer shape that it needs to be able to fight something like a runes, but also something like, a dragon combo and something like an Esper. So yeah, it's just like, if you like mid-range, I mean, this is a great format for you because you're in a mid-range mirror like almost every game.
Have you given any thoughts to Alchemy? Have you given up on it, or are you hoping to see some cards change? The next Alchemy update is, I believe, June 2nd.
No, I haven't spent much. Again, I'm not one of the people that had no fun playing Alchemy. I thought I saw the potential in it. It's not something I'm actively tracking because they introduce new formats in a way that I don't think you can invest and sustain the number of formats they have. So I'm trying to even like pick winners and losers among all the different formats they've picked in terms of the level of support it'll see going forward. And level of support for me means like, what's the likelihood that I'm going to need to do this at a high level at some point in the future? And it's just like, there's just too much of it. So I tend to, like, as a coping mechanism, tune it all out until I have to focus on it. If there were fewer formats, I would probably have a current understanding of Alchemy and of Modern and of other formats, but there just isn't. So instead, I just sort of bounce around. If it's not the format of the next tournament, I'm not super focused on it. So no, but again, I'm not like a doomsayer, but like Alchemy's not the worst thing that ever happened, but I don't know that it's going to receive sustained investment that would lead me to want to invest.
Yeah, I'm going to try it again when the new cards come out, and hopefully there's a couple of cards toned down in it too. But I get why a lot of people just it doesn't appeal to them.
Actually, I mean, I should say, the videos that you post about the format do appeal to me because I think there is like cool space in there to build new decks and they'll make new cards that are interesting to explore. So, if they release another 6 cards next week and then you post a video saying, hey, I'm going to try this one out, I'm happy to watch that video. But I'm not where my head hits the pillow at night. I'm not like waking up going, oh, I just thought of something about Alchemy. That's just not the incentive structure they've set up.
I don't know if you even paid enough attention to it to see the last set of buffs they did to cards right before the historic testing period. They actually changed a few cards. Like that's Painful Bond got nerfed, which actually had an impact on historic. But they also buffed like 10 alchemy cards where it's just all these random creatures they added 1 toughness to in a way that it was just, it didn't move the needle at all on them. It was like, this was an unplayable card. It would be, you could make it into a 4/4 instead of being a 2/2, and it would still be unplayable. But they're being really, really safe in a lot of the changes. I wish they would be a little bit more ambitious with them.
Yeah, they're stuck. I mean, it's because they don't want to do too much. They don't want to do too little, and every time they sort of aim a certain place, their accuracy isn't that good. So then they aim low, they get, like you just said, they aim low and they go way too low, and then now it's like these people have to learn the new cards. They don't do anything. They aim high, it goes too high. So I think like whatever, we don't fully know their investment in the development of Alchemy cards and how much polish and playtesting they get before launch, but they've clearly changed their calibration on where they're aiming, but their accuracy is just pretty poor. So that is one of the problems with the format. But I liked cards like the Clone Crafter. I thought like cards like that if they if they could just get away from the misses and let cards like that be good cards, where it's like I get a random card from my opponent's deck and a little bit of value, and like now the game's play out very differently, and that was meaningful progress on the axis that you talked about, playing interesting games that feel different, that feel interesting, exciting, like fun puzzles to solve. That's a good. It's nice when you get to scratch that itch. Like this game feels like a little fun little puzzle. Cards like Clone Craft, it's like do what you got to do to make that card be good, and then I think Alchemy is like in a cool spot. But it's like if that card exists, but you're sort of a fool to play it, then Alchemy has a problem.
Yeah, I think that's you pretty much hit the nail on the head for why Alchemy appeals to me. Is I just like the cards they've been able to create that actually lead to different game states, and it doesn't have the feeling like Standard does a lot of time, where you're just playing the same game over and over. Especially once Standard gets kind of solved, which it was. I think it was pretty solved by the time that the Set Championship happened. That people realized that it all revolved around this handful of really busted 3-drops you could play, and it was just all about kind of trying to engineer a game state where like you were the person who got to be on the front foot with the busted 3-drop, and once everyone knows that, you just play a lot of games where like you're hoping your tech allows you to be 55% and your opponent's 45%. But really, you're just not going to get to play a very wide variety of games.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Anyway, final topic. Do you know what the next tournament's going to be for you? Is there anything coming up you're excited about, or you have any trepidation about?
Yeah, the right now I'm in the middle of the Star Wars CCG Online Championship Series, or OCS. Star Wars CCG is a game that's free to play online. It's actually community run. So like imagine if Wizards of the Coast went out of business. Not that I'm wishing for that, but imagine that Wizards of the Coast went out of business and the community said, you know what, we'll just run the game and make it a free to play thing. And that's what Star Wars CCG is. And the online championship series, you get 12 matches in a month. And if you can go 11-1 or 12-0, you might make the top 2 to make it to the championship. It's a really fun tournament. I'm 9-1 right now. I've gotten lucky. I'm not one of the better players at that game, but I've gotten lucky through 10 games. I'm hoping to get lucky for 2 more games. So that's what's next for me. Having a lot of fun with that.
Yeah.
You?
Well, the first qualifier weekend for the replacement for the Set Championships is happening this weekend. I think they're called the Arena Championships now. And I'm kind of excited about this tournament series. It's a little bit like the mock system on Magic Online has been for like the past 3 or 4 years. The qualification structure is not quite as engaging. Like it is much more that you have to spike, and you're going to get one opportunity a month to try to spike. It's really hard to qualify for. But if you actually get to the Arena Championships, it's a really good tournament. It looks like it's a 32-person tournament that has a prize pool that's like $200,000. So small field, like good sized prize pool. It's not clear whether or not you're going to have to travel to play in the Arena Championships, but I think that's got a potential to actually be a pretty exciting tournament, and something that's going to like drive competitive play in a way that is appealing on Arena, that like the Set Championships kind of failed to do, and like the MPL failed to do. I mean, it's Wizards. There's still probably going to be a bunch of stuff that they screw up, and hopefully they can fix it and improve upon it as they go along, which isn't always what they do. But I'm pretty positive about it for now.
So what
it is going to be. Sorry, go ahead.
To play this weekend, do you have to have finished like a certain amount of Mythic ranking, or is it just do you play gems and play? And then I'm not versed in the structure of it. And then this is just like you got to win this tournament this weekend, and you get one of those 32 slots. Like how do you get from here to there in this one?
All right, so there's a qualifier, which in the past they would have been called MCQs, and they fed into the Set Championship. I I don't know what the technical name of the qualifier is now, but it's a Saturday, Sunday qualifier that it's harder to get through the qualifier because it's feeding into a 32-person tournament instead of like a several hundred-person tournament, which the set
Right.
championships were. So I think you need to go 7-1 both days, which is that's really hard to do. But it's really rewarding if you do get to do it. To get into that qualifier, they changed it a little bit. You can now, I think, if you finished in the top 250 on either of the ladders from the month before, you get into it automatically, or you have to play in it's like a last chance thing to get into it, essentially,
Okay.
which is roughly the equivalent of making it through day one of an arena open. So actually, the first opportunity to do this was last weekend, where they ran the best of one version of it, which I never played the best of one ones. I think you need to get to 7 wins before you get 2 or 3 losses, something like that.
Okay.
On Friday, there's going to be the best of 3 form of the last chance qualifier, which you need to go 4-0. Unfortunately, the format for all of this stuff is Streets of New Capenna limited, so it's going to be sealed up until day 2 of the actual MCQ thing, which would be draft. I don't know if you've played much Streets of New Capenna limited. It's not one of their stronger showings in recent years.
Okay.
It's pretty reminiscent of like Guilds of Ravnica.
Well, good luck in it. You won't see me in there, but not because I wouldn't play limited, but because I haven't. I got a baby and other stuff going on, but I'm encouraged that they're investing in it in that way. And I think even if this set isn't the greatest for sealed deck and draft, like a lot of sets are fun and it's at a high level. I think those things get pretty interesting. So, sounds like a good time. Format maybe notwithstanding, but good luck in it. And maybe if it's one of those formats where you got to open cards in the right color or with the right rarity symbol, hope you get there. Hope it happens to you.
Next month is going to be Explorer, Explorer's looking like a pretty fun format.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's mostly fun because it hasn't really been all that solved yet, but I've been mostly playing Explorer on Arena, and you play against a pretty wide variety of stuff, and there's like a good variety of strategies. It definitely feels like historic, but without all of like the obvious tier 1 decks. Like it's not clear what the top tier of decks is.
I liked early days of Pioneer when people were, again, like you said, willing to try something different and experiment. You play against people who are sort of playing their favorite cards from 3 years ago. Yeah. Anyways, I like that format where people are still getting their bearings, but like they don't feel compelled to play one of 3 or 4 strategies. Yeah, that sounds fun. Might check that one out.
All right. Well, I think that's all I've got for tonight. So, do you have anything else you want to bring up, or should we?
No, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Keep up the good work with the content. And folks, if you haven't liked and subscribed, what are you waiting for? Come on. All right.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for watching.